Hello and welcome back, and that is right, today we're looking at another mini PC come network attached storage device. It has to be said, this middle ground, again we've talked about it before time and time again on the channel, the middle ground between turnkey NAS solutions from QNAP, Synology and more, and full DIY where you have to build things with a solder underneath your fingertips. In the middle there is a lot more of these solutions rocking out the gate with no OS on board, with the exception of maybe a moody Windows license, but giving you the ability to take advantage of Unraid, TrueNAS, Open Media Vault and more. And this comes from the brand OcuLink, or as it says on the box, Tianbe. Not 100% certain what that means, but OcuLink is a brand we have talked about on the channel before when they released the R1 and R7 device that we talked about at the end of 2023. Now this is a purely NVMe focused NAS. It's a little flash system, and again a lot of us are going to be looking at this and wondering what the hell the difference is between this and a mini PC. And I would argue, although I've mentioned a lot of mini PC architecture-esque NAS devices on the channel previously, I'd say this one is a lot more in the direction of NAS than many I've talked about. Also, it's a mini PC NAS with mini PC style NAS that I would argue has got far less compromise than a number of the devices I've talked about in the past. We'll get onto that later on. But with it, you get your little external PSU, and I would say it's quite a decent quality external PSU. If we look at the back here, it is a Hunt key external adapter, and the build quality is pretty darn good all the way down to the cable and connector. Also alongside that, you get your instruction manual, which is all, well, I'll be honest, the bits that are in English, I'm not following that well. Alongside that, you get your thermal pads for your SSDs. You've got wall mounting clips, that is right. You've got the ability to mount this device on a wall, and you've got the option, if you buy from their site, to get it with storage inside. The 0 TB or the empty model of this knocks around at the moment for $379, but you can get the device with, I believe, half a gig, 1 TB and 2 TB of storage there inside, and all of them arrive with 32 gig of LPDDR5 memory. More on that later on. Now again, alongside the configurations of storage and NAND, this device also arrives with different CPUs. Now the one I'm holding here is the AMD embedded Ryzen 7, so that is the 6800H, and that's using kind of Mobilize or SoC CPU components that's basically taking those big bulky desktop CPUs and making a much more energy efficient compact version of them. It's an 8-core 16-thread processor. The TDP is rated at 28, 35 and 45 depending on how you want to set it up during the BIOS, and I'll be straight with you, the BIOS on this device is intense. I've not seen such an intense little BIOS list in a very long time. They've really threw all the options there. There isn't a lot of curation to remove stuff. So you really are in a position to really configure the hell out of this thing. And also with that power consumption there, the power goes all the way up to 4.7 gigahertz when needed. It also has Radiant integrated graphics as well. So again, whether you're looking at this for Plex containers or VMs, we've got a lot of boxes being ticked there. Now, when we had the device set up in idle, we saw power consumption surprisingly low. This was with 3 populated M2 NVMe's, 1 Gen 3, 2 Gen 4 times 4 SSDs inside, and we saw as low as 11.2 when the system was in idle. That was complete non-access idle for the drives. Now, when we had each of the drives having performance measurements happening to them live, we saw the power go up to 34.6 watts with the CPU around about 30 to 35% utilization. So not out of this world use, and those numbers not too shabby there either. Now, in terms of the memory, that 32 gig arrives via 4 individual 8 gig NAND cells internally. It is not ECC. It is not upgradable, which is going to be a real bummer for those of you that looked at this CPU and saw, 1, it supports ECC in the right configuration. This isn't it. And you can have up to 64 gig, but unfortunately not the case. Soldered non-ECC LPDDR5 memory at 6400 mega transfers. As good as that is, just keep in mind that's the roof. They can't go higher than that. 32 gig is plenty, but certainly there's going to be those of you that have heard Gen 4 SSDs, Flash NAS, and gone, where's my frigging error correcting code or error correction code? Circling back to that CPU, when we did do performance measurements with the inclusive Windows 11 OS that it arrived with before we stuck Unraid on it via a USB, where GeekBench rated that CPU single core at 2039 and multi-core at 9435, and in terms of GPU, a little over 29,000 there. So pretty respectable cores for a NAS system. Keep that in mind. Now, that hardware architecture, that CPU, also opens the door to Gen 4. And, as mentioned earlier, each of those M2 NVMe slots are Gen 4 times 4. The slot with the OS drive that was inside and the other two. And I dug in via terminal on Unraid, and we saw that there was no downgrade. Each one of those slots is the full 4 times 4 bandwidth afforded to it. Now, all of this stuff I've said, your 8 cores, your 16 threads, talking about 32 gig of memory, talking about all those storage. What about temperatures on this device? Now, this device is absolutely riddled in ventilation and cooling. There's a base fan at the bottom, quite a chunky little fan I might add as well, and there's an additional laptop style fan and further ventilation under that GEM logo. For such a small device, they have packed in all manner of hardware and had to keep things cool. Now, during operation, we saw the peak noise around about 32 to 34 dB. Now, the highest noise we saw at boot, so we at least got to experience it at its highest volume. But I'm not going to say it was whisper quiet. It really, really wasn't. But in the middle of a general, busy office, or even myself working on my own with a few NAS servers within about 4 to 5 meters of my position, this wasn't that bad, and I was quite happy with the noise levels. If I was in close proximity, maybe a meter and a half, somewhat, maybe slightly different there. I would say moving beyond that, we can talk about the port to connection, because that is where there's kind of mixed feelings. If we go to the rear of the device, we've got a couple of a couple of 2.5 gigabit Ethernet ports there. That's really a lot. There's no 10 GBE here. There's not even the room to an adapter there, because as you may see from the other side, we do have a USB 4 port there. That USB 4 port, again, 40 gigabits per second means you can take advantage of much, much faster external drive. They're giving you 3,300 to about 3,500 megabytes per second for your backups. So that is lovely stuff there. Also, each of those USB ports there on the front and the back, all of them, the main USB ports are all USB 3.2 Gen 2, all 10 gig USBs, which means you can bolster up with the right compatible NAS software. You can add 2.5G and 5G adapters for even more network connectivity on this. It's just a shame it's not a Thunderbolt port, because if it's a Thunderbolt port, we may be moving towards that ability to use the system as a client and system as a host, and maybe client-equipped external Thunderbolt to 10 GBE connections that kind of add and bolster on more network adapters there. But that said, what this does have that I've not seen from pretty much any of the mini PC come moody OS-free NAS devices in the market right now is this at the bottom. OcuLink. Now, OcuLink is not new, but I'm not going to say it's old either. It is predominantly the means to add eGPUs, external PCIe devices, again, predominantly focused towards graphics, I should say, with GPU cards, and it allows that pass-through for an external PSU, it doesn't support hot swapping, by the way, to add external PCIe upgrades to a compact system like this. Now, there are, from what I can see, some external PCIe docks that will allow you to add other cards. Now, I've not really seen anything online where OcuLink has been utilized to add external network adapters for your 10G, your 25G, 5, or even 40G and higher, but that doesn't mean it's not possible. It doesn't mean that's not going to happen. And that's what I mean. Them adding OcuLink here is a nice little nod. It's not as good as a PCIe, it's not as usable as a PCIe, but at least it's something there. Now, alongside those two 2.5 gigabit Ethernet ports there on the rear, there is also Wi-Fi 6 inside. There's a Wi-Fi AX200 adapter inside. It's a 2x2, so 5 gigahertz, 2.4 gigahertz, two antennae running on the inside. So you've got a decent amount of failover there, and also depending on the NAS software you use, you could actually use it as a dedicated outward or inward coming NIC. But again, very dependent on which NAS software you're going to choose to use. In terms of performance, when we had the device set up in Unraid, we did some relatively light benchmarks of the system, because what we're actually going to be doing is trying to turn this into an arcade machine. A video coming up soon on that, a remote access arcade NAS server. But this device, we had it populated with those Seagate Ironwolf 525s. Those are NAS-focused M2 NVMe's at Gen 4. So we put them inside. So although we're not going to be able to get, take advantage of 7 gigabytes per second SSDs like your WD Blacks, your Samsung 980 and 990s, we still went for NAS-focused SSDs. Now, the Seagate Ironwolf 525 has a reported 5 gigabytes per second maximum read and 4.5 or 4.4 gigabytes per second write of sustained performance there. In this system, we had it in Unraid, doing some general 1 gig performance numbers there. We saw read performance, we got it up to 5.12 gigabytes, and in terms of write, we got it at 3.85 gigabytes. So again, pretty respectable numbers given the SSDs that we had inside. But I will say that when we did the same test to see data being copied between them, then things really dropped. I've seen similar architecture, CWWK and Topton boards to this, where we've seen SSD transfers hitting 2.5 gig. This barely got outside of 1.115 gigabytes per second transfer for the internal SSDs. I didn't have enough time to figure out more about why that was happening, as we've got all of our Gen 4 SSDs being allocated on other projects right now. And again, as mentioned, there will be a follow-up video on this device. But nonetheless, the general performance I liked, but there was definitely something of a hurdle with the data being moved inside the system, whether that was the way the lanes have been allocated there, or maybe certain components and chips and the transfer. Again, we're not taking it apart yet, but in the written review link below, we'll go into a lot more detail and start ripping this thing apart once we've finished a couple more videos here on the channel. All in all, the GEM10, if you can get it for that $379, $399 price tag, is a bloody good M2 NVMe SSD NAS. Remember, it's got Gen 4 x 4 slot on each of those M2 NVMe's. I know there's only 3, but that's still a pretty decent number. And although it is only 2.5 gigabit Ethernet on the rear, at least you've got that Wi-Fi failover and a lot of super fast USBs to maybe start looking at upgrading it. Yes, it's not as good as a single 10 GBE, but there are options. And don't overlook the inclusion of that OcuLink. I think there's a lot to be said for that moving forward. And USB 4 means super fast backups, and possibly even more than that. This is far removed from something like this, your little mini PCs. A lot more work has gone into the cooling systems inside, and you can feel it in the weight, you can feel it in the quality of the device. I'm not going to say it's a perfect NAS. I think a lot of perfect NASs out there would have 10 GBE with this kind of architecture, or maybe they could forsake a few things, maybe bring those slots down to 4x2, and maybe by purification, we could have added another M2 NVMe inside. But those small gripes aside, to find a great performance measurement between high performance SSDs and the number of storage bays, this is a decent little balance for in the middle. And also, given that there are other CPU combinations out there supported on this, and indeed the GEM12 series, which takes even beefier CPUs into the fold, it means that AOOSTAR, or again, Tianbei, aren't over and done with yet in terms of NASs, and it looks like they're really doubling down on this. And hopefully we'll be talking about more of their products very, very soon. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching. Again, written article linked into the description with lots more images, and we'll be tearing this apart and updating that article as well as a follow-up video on this very, very soon. But thank you so much for watching. Have yourselves a great weekend, and I'll see you next time.